You're on mute, Jade.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have Dr. Allison Monterrosa and Sophia Davis joined with us to talk about the impact of the carceral state on African American women. And before we get started, we're going to have Connie lead us in a land acknowledgement and then go to introductions for our guests.
Hello, everybody. CSUSB Land Acknowledgement is, we recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of San Bernardino, San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty, and we will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American, Indian, and Indigenous people.
So just to introduce our guests, first we have Sophia Davis. She is a recent graduate of the United Nations International School in Manhattan, where she developed an interest in race, social justice, and the criminal justice system. She is currently doing an internship with Police Reform Organizing Project under the direction of Dr. Robert Gangi, and she will discuss the organization as well as her current summer research.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see so many people interested in the impact of the carceral state on African American women. My name is Sophia Davis. I'm 18 years old, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Hopefully I can provide a bit of a more youthful perspective on the topic and sort of a foundational understanding of the NYPD and in my own experiences from what I've seen and what I've researched. I'm not an expert on anything that I'm talking about. I'm just incredibly passionate about it, and hopefully I can sort of provide a better understanding of what young political activists are doing in the city nowadays. So I have grown up in a family that's always discussed racial tensions in the United States. And as a result, I think it's kind of created a really conflicting sense of reality and crime and policing in the United States. Because on the one hand, there's white America and the media and the education system and our history textbooks that are shoving this narrative down our throats that the police as they exist today are a force for good, a benevolent force in our society. And on the other hand, there's this reality that's taking shape in front of my eyes that just doesn't match with that. I was 11 years old when Michael Brown was killed, kind of in the beginning stages, the foundational years of Black Lives Matter. And just a few months later, I was sitting in history class one day and my teacher mentioned Eric Garner's name in passing. And I just typed his name into my Chromebook and watched this man get brutally murdered and strangled by NYPD officers with the same exact uniform of the people that I see patrolling the streets and swarming the subways every single day. So there's these two kind of messages that are being sent to me constantly. And so those conflicting messages are where my curiosity comes from. But I want to give you a sense of the NYPD in particular, because I think it's a really unique police department. I think when we talk about policing and police brutality across the United States, there are certain things that are that police departments have in common, but the NYPD is especially sinister in a lot of ways. So for those of you that are familiar with the West Coast and Los Angeles, the LAPD presides over 465 to 500 square miles of land, whereas the NYPD presides over 305 square miles approximately. The LAPD, for these 500 square miles, there are 9,000 to 10,000 officers, whereas in New York City, for 305 square miles, we have 35,000 officers. That's a big, big difference. Now, I recognize the fact that LA has a much different population than New York. It's around like 3 million last time I checked, and New York is 8.5 million. But that's what makes it so interesting, is because you have a city in such a small landmass with so many cops, so many different ideas, different communities that are being policed in different ways. And that's where I become even more curious, and I want to talk about it even more. And it kind of, this goes back to this idea of clashing narratives, because, you know, on the one hand, you've got people that are vehemently defending the cops. On the other hand, you have people that are like, wait, but they're destroying my community. They're locking up so many of the people that I know and love and sending them to Rikers Island every day. To get a good sense, I think, of these clashing narratives, I want everyone, when the panel is finished, just look up NYPD latest news. I did that when I was researching for the presentation a couple days ago. And on the one hand, I found an article about, it's from the New York Post, about 2 officers that saved a dog from the East River. They're just, and the article just goes on and on about how, you know, this is what these liberals, they want to defund the police, but they're out here saving dogs from the East River. We can't defund the police. Who's going to save the dogs? On the other hand, there's an article about a mother that's suing the department for tasing her son to death. These are really, really strong ideas and opinions that are clashing with each other. And there's data actually released by the city that in 2019, there were 1,383 civil lawsuits filed against the NYPD. It's down around 300 civil lawsuits from the year before in 2018. But 2019, those civil lawsuits cost New York City taxpayers over $68.5 million. And that's up 76% from the year before. So that's terrifying, that's jarring, but putting those numbers aside, there's still this mythology that there's this rampant violent crime that the cops exist to control and reduce. But ask anybody who touts that claim, if they've ever sat in an arraignment court before, and the vast majority of them are going to say, no, they haven't. But I can tell you, as someone that spent hours in arraignment courts gathering information on who's coming in, who's being arrested, the vast majority of these cases are nonviolent, and they're quite honestly a complete waste of time and taxpayer money. So I've been to the Bronx, I've been to Brooklyn, Lower Manhattan, and Queens criminal courts. I'm trying to go to every court in the city. I still have to go to Midtown and Staten Island. And I'm gathering information on these arraignments. I'm taking down docket numbers, the race, the gender, age, whether or not the person's in custody, the charges that are against them, the verdict, whether or not they're released. And I'm also just writing down random notes. How do judges refer to certain people versus other people? What are the cops doing? Oftentimes I walk into the room, it's completely legal, by the way, for you to monitor the courtroom. I walk in the room, I sit there, immediately I'm approached by 2 to 3 cops that ask me, can I help you? What are you doing here? Are you watching? Is there someone here whose case you're trying to see? And that just it's very obvious that the cops don't want people in the room. They don't want people to see what's going on behind the scenes. But I'm there and I'm gathering this information. And I think I want to highlight one case that I saw just a few days ago when I was in the Bronx criminal court, that it demonstrates how, not only how individual lives are being destroyed, but how entire communities and families, and particularly Black women, are being affected and are being broken down by this system. So there was one man who was arrested for a robbery. He had a criminal record. He had a gun conviction from a few years ago. He was a violent felon, and he served his time in state prison. He was on parole, getting off parole in December, I believe. And he's arrested for an alleged robbery. Now, the photo that the cops used to identify this man, the reference photo they used, the person that's in that photo had a mask on. So they don't even know what this person actually looks like, and they're going out here trying to find someone to arrest. So they find this guy, the one that's in the courtroom, they find him. He shows them video evidence of the fact that of his alibi, the fact that he wasn't there at the time when the crime was committed. He was in a completely different place at the same exact time. clear evidence that he didn't commit the crime. But guess what they did? They arrested him anyways. And now this man is sitting in front of the courtroom. He's sitting in front of the judge, and his defender is pleading with the judge. He's pleading with the judge. He's pretty much begging, saying, you know, he said, I have a family, I have a business, I have children. I have people that depend on me, and I can't do this right now. I didn't do this. There's evidence that shows that I didn't do this. I cannot spend time in jail. I simply cannot do it. But he wasn't released. And for all we know, he's on Rikers Island right now. And for anyone that knows anything about Rikers Island, there's currently a humanitarian crisis that's taking place there. Those incarcerated on Rikers Island do not have consistent access to food and water. The facilities are so broken down, there's raw sewage everywhere. And people are dying, people are committing suicide, and they are dying from disease. They're not getting proper medical care. There are people with broken arms and legs that have not been treated. There are guards that aren't even showing up to work anymore because they don't see the point, because the city is not coming to help to save them. And there are people, you're typically supposed to only spend 24 to 48 hours on Rikers Island. But there are people that had their court date, and someone was supposed to come and pick them up on that date to take them to court, and no one ever showed up. And so they've been sitting on Rikers Island, rotting for months, 3 months, 6 months, 8 months. People who cannot get in contact with their family members, can't get in contact with their lawyers. People are dying there. And for all we know, this man who didn't even commit this crime, it was so obvious in that one arraignment case that he did not commit this crime. He could be there right now. And to tie this back into the general topic that we're discussing here, the impact that this has on Black women, all of the responsibilities that he had towards his housing and his children, all of that is now going to fall on his partner. She is going to have to deal with the cost of housing. She's going to have to deal with food, with taking care of the children. All of these responsibilities now fall onto her. And this is happening to hundreds of thousands, to millions of people, and to so many communities around the country. So that's me. That's what I'm doing. That's my research. Hopefully that gives you a better sense of what's going on in the city, and the ways in which policing, from what I've seen, is affecting African-American women and African-American and Hispanic lives. Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sophie. That was wonderful. Next, we have Dr. Allison Monterrosa. She is a sociologist and assistant professor of ethnic studies at CSU San Marcos. Her areas of specialization address racialized gender-based violence, the criminal legal justice system, state violence, and the health implications of racism. As a community-based researcher who centers the experiences of racial, ethnic, marginalized communities, her research and teaching pedagogy emphasizes structural and cultural competence and intersects with community and service work to promote social justice and health equity. Her work has been published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, Feminist, Criminology, and Rutgers Criminal Law and Criminal Justice books.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Jade. And thank you for having me and inviting me to share my research with the CSUSB community and the community more broadly. So I'm going to share my screen. So give me just one moment, please. And let me know if you can see it. So I'm going to share it now. Can you see that okay? Okay. All right. And I'm going to close this. And I want to go to, sorry, I talk to myself when I do this. Play from start, yes. Okay, so the title of my talk today is called The Impact of the Carceral State on the Lives of African-American Women. And so just as Sophia was talking, Black women are disproportionately impacted by the carceral state. And so my research, I set out to look at what does that look like in terms of Black women's interior lives, and more specifically, their romantic lives and intimate lives. So my research aim was, what role does criminal legal system impacted Black women perceive mass incarceration to play in their romantic relationships? And so I used an intersectional frame, and the intersecting variables of Black women were that they were criminal legal system impacted, meaning they live in communities and come from communities that are heavily impacted by mass incarceration. So we're talking about hypercriminalization, hypersurveillance, people cycling in and out of the prison and jail system. And we understand that the effects of mass incarceration has had devastating consequences in disrupting entire communities. And so another variable was their romantic relationships and what do they look like? And they were also heterosexual Black women. So for my methodology, I had a small sample size of 31 women. It was a qualitative study where I used semi-structured in-depth interviews. The characteristics of my participants were Black women, system-impacted Black women, 18 to 65 years old, and were working class, heterosexual, and they reside in the Inland Empire in Southern California, and more specifically within San Bernardino and Moreno Valley and Riverside County. And so I'm using a broad definition of criminal legal system impacted. So that means to say either they were themselves impacted by the criminal legal system directly, and or they had family members and just lived in communities that, again, as I said, were heavily impacted with hypersurveillance, hypercriminalization. And my analysis and my research design is also informed by my own positionality as a Black woman, also criminal legal system impacted, and also survivor of intimate partner violence. I come from a neighborhood that was heavily policed. I've seen many of my friends, community members, people I just went to school with be rounded up and sent off to prison for very, very long jail sentences, excuse me. And so this has had an impact on the way in which I view the world. And so that's a part of my own positionality when I come into this work. And so part of my participants, in terms of the kinds of jobs that they had, so some were college students, some were administrative assistants, some worked at big warehouses, such as Amazon, others were retired, there were some who were waitresses, there were LVNs, and so their occupations varied. And so as I spoke about earlier, they often, my participants came from a community that's heavily impacted by mass incarceration. And as a result, that impacts on their choices in terms of who to partner with and who they have access to partner with, and if their partners have also had criminal legal system impacts. So I use a theoretical framework of Black feminist theory, and that's Patricia Hill Collins, and she talks about the matrix of domination, looking at the different intersecting structures that create barriers for Black women and act as different kinds of oppressive forces. I use intersectionality, where you're looking at race, class, gender, and sexuality as intersecting variables that impact Black women's experiences in relation to broader power structures, right? So we're talking about power when we're talking about intersectionality. And then Black feminist criminology, that's, that's Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. Black feminist criminology is Hillary Potter. And this looks at and recognizes the different historical racialized stigmas that Black women experience at both the interpersonal and structural levels. And so this is a little graph that I put together, just looking at the different types of romantic statuses the women were involved in and their levels of criminal legal system impact. So I had 6 different romantic statuses. So not dating or not seeking a relationship, those who were in situationships, which, as a caveat, for those who don't know what a situationship, it's a non-committal relationship that not supposed to have any expectation of long-term partnership. But there were some varying definitions amongst the partners. And I'll talk a little bit about that later and why that happened to be problematic for some of the women. Then women were divorced and dating, divorced and not dating, and then single and dating and single and not dating. And then they had varying degrees of criminal legal system impact. And so what did I find? So in terms of having these conversations with women, you have a 46-year-old woman who's single and dating. She says, they're in and out of jail. There's no time to build a good relationship like that. Him dealing with other women while he was in there. And it's worse because it continued when he got out too. So that was one of the salient points that came out of my interviews with many of the women, is that they were thinking about infidelity and cheating as one of the ways in which they were navigating and choosing whether to be in these relationships or not. Another participant, 38 years old, in a situationship, says, I didn't think it really mattered. And here she's discussing cheating and being with other women. I thought we were going to break up anyway. There's always this idea in the back of our minds that he'll be gone again soon anyway. So why bother getting upset about it? And so that speaks to some of the precariousness that women were experiencing in their relationships. This idea that, well, I can't really depend on this as being a stable relationship because he's likely to go back to jail soon again anyway. So really trying not to invest too much emotional labor in that relationship. Another participant, 21-year-old, single and not dating, they're all in jail or got some case or something going on. I mean, yeah, it is an issue, but I don't want that. And so some women, and it really skewed more towards the younger women who were saying, who are opting out and saying, I'd rather not date right now. And I don't want to deal with someone who is criminal legal system impacted. It's just too much. So they're making other choices in their lives, particularly with this young woman. She was in school working on her associates. So moving on to some other dynamics the women were discussing is that we have a 24-year-old woman who's in a situationship, and she says, it makes me crazy. It is like I don't know what to do. Let me know, but it is like he's leading me on, but he says we're not because we're not together. He says he's not because we are not together, but everything else says we are together. And we could talk a little bit about, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about the specifics of the situationship that women were having a lot of frustration around that, particularly when it came to the ways in which they define their relationship and or maybe a lack thereof definition. Another participant, prison changed him. And that was a salient theme throughout. Women were discussing how their partners, something that they knew something about the experience of jail and or prison changed the ways in which they were able to relate to their partners. Another 33-year-old single and dating. I mean, it's not their fault. Like Black men are being hunted right now. No, seriously, they are. People don't know how hard it is out here. And that's something else that came up where women were aware of the pressures and the hypercriminalization that has gone on in their communities. And so they're taking that into account too when they're making their choices and decisions about being in romantic relationships. So what this caused was kind of an emotional, devastating experience for women, particularly when their goals and dreams of trying to be in a partnership or resume an existing partnership after incarceration that would entail emotional connection and reciprocal instrumental and emotional support, it goes unmet. And so there was some frustration there, some sadness, some loneliness, some feelings of not being able to kind of meet this dominant standard of partnership that we have in our society. So women were also engaged in racialized gendered labor. Much of it was both instrumental and emotional. So things such as supplying transportation to parole, probation, courts, visits, and or work for their partners, providing childcare for their partners, assistance with paperwork associated with probation, parole, and court, procuring visitations, which takes a lot of time. This is all very time consuming. Some women would take off of work in order to do this kind of work. The assisting their partners with the paperwork associated with bringing children to visitation, particularly if they are not the legal guardian, that requires some type of notarized paperwork, which also requires a lot of time. And also the other part that which really my work looks at is what happens with Black women emotionally, right? So managing the stressors of trying to maintain romantic and familial ties becomes an overwhelming task for many of the women. So to that point, they were experiencing a level of emotional and psychological abuse. And some women experienced distress that their labor and pouring into their partners and providing them with resources and care, that it didn't actually lead to committed partnership, which is what the goal of many of the women in the study, aside for those who were single and not dating and divorced and not dating, they wanted to have a relationship that leads to long-term committed partnership. And so there's frustration when that didn't happen. Also, there's shame and stigma associated with the perceived inability to partner. As I said, in our society, we have dominant ways of thinking about partnership. And in particularly, it's very gendered, right? When we think about, women who are single and, haven't married by a certain age, there's a particular kind of stigma associated with that. And then not to mention the fact that with Black women, they also experience a kind of racial, racialized sexism because of both being Black and a woman, right? And so we see those intersections there as well. And so there's a lot of, there were stereotypes that Black women were trying to manage when it comes to partnering. And then some women also experience feelings of fear, sadness, frustration, loneliness. Now here we can talk about the situationships a little bit more in depth. So this group experienced the most distress and most of the psychological and emotional abuse. They were talking about being gaslit all the time by their partners, because when they were engaging in relationships and seeing their partner, and again, that means to say that they were sexually available to their partners, they were pouring different kinds of instrumental labor and resources, such as, like I was talking before about giving them rides. Some of them would give them money, rides to work, food, right? All of these, sometimes even shelter. And so when those kinds of resources and that kind of labor didn't lead to the committed relationship that they were looking for, it caused frustration and sadness and confusion. And a little bit of crazy making was going on, because the women would say, hey, they viewed that situationship as a jumping off point to a committed relationship, whereas the men viewed it as, well, I don't owe you any accountability because we're not together. And so in some ways, the term or the label of situationship was weaponized against some of the women. In some instances, the women described the situationship as being agentic and an empowering choice that they were making for themselves, in that they were free to see whomever they'd like, but through further investigation around this, were they actually doing that? In fact, they were not. They were pouring a lot of their resources into the one person that they were engaged in the situationship with. And that's not to say that the women in the relationships were not making choices and being agentic around that, just given their own understandings of their particular social locations. And so I have this idea of intimate carceral violence, because part of what the women were describing is that it's not so much that the partners themselves, and thankfully I will say, the women in my study were not experiencing physical violence. And most men are not physically violent, right? Most men are not abusers, right? And so that's a good thing. But certainly the men were taking advantage of the women in these other ways that I discussed earlier. And so the effects of the systematic mass incarceration, it produces, reproduces, and cultivates conditions that are dangerous and often deadly for Black women in their intimate relationships. And so while I'm not looking here specifically at physical violence, although we do know that intimate partner violence is a thing, and we know that emotional and psychological abuse is also a thing and a part of a set of different types of behaviors within the intimate partner violence structure. I'm looking at a lot of stressors that the women were experiencing, engaging in these different relationships with men who are criminal legal system impacted. And so it's the stress of navigating both the carceral system and their romantic relationships. Intimate carceral violence also precipitates behaviors that are counterproductive to cultivating healthy romantic relationships. And so this speaks to the kinds of behavior that the women were talking about they experienced with their partners. So stonewalling is one, right? It's this idea of, particularly around, I don't owe you any accountability and I don't need to tell you my whereabouts and who I'm with and all of that. Yet on the other hand, the men were actually demanding that of the women. And many times the women complied with those demands in hopes that that would, again, lead to long-term committed relationship and just better treatment in the relationship. Also, I talked a little bit about gaslighting, and that was, largely saw in the situationships. But this other piece, right, it also speaks to what prison does to people, right? The inability to be vulnerable, sharing emotions and connecting. When you are in a space that's you're hyper surveilled, a violent place where someone like a prison where someone has total control, it's not safe for you to share your emotions and wear your emotions on your sleeve, right? It's a survival tactic. But those kinds of survival tactics are not conducive to creating vulnerable relationships where you have to be vulnerable, right? Because that's where the relationship comes in, and the connection is being vulnerable with another person. And so in that way, the carceral system is disrupting the ways in which the women were able to engage in their romantic relationships. So we're seeing the carceral system itself seep into the most intimate of spaces of Black women's lives. And just more broadly, yes, carceral violence, intimate carceral violence functions to maintain power and control over a specific racial, ethnic, marginalized group. And so I also talk about romantic precarity. And so here I'm building off of Gloria Anzaldua's work, Cherry Moraga, where they're talking about, all of the factors that contribute to vulnerability to mass incarceration. So unemployment, underemployment, joblessness, high levels of violence, high levels of poverty. But in this case, I'm taking the precarity frame and applying it to the romantic lives of women. And so it describes the instability of women's relationship and their relationship choices. And so I said earlier, you see hypercriminalization and incarceration. It does impact on the ability to find and maintain relationships. And it also produces an opportunity gap. So when we're talking about precarity, and we're used to thinking about precarity in economic terms, and looking at the material benefits of lost opportunities and the creation of opportunity gaps. Well, here, the opportunity gap is the inability or the barriers associated with trying to find and maintain romantic connection, and then the benefits of romantic partnership. In our society, we have, in terms of just sociality, partnerships offer up a lot of, psychosocial benefit, not just, economic benefits, in terms of pooling resources together, wealth building opportunities. And then, beyond all of those sorts of things, we think about self-actualization through partnership, right? And so this is what the women were seeking, and then we're disappointed in not being able to find and fulfill those particular goals. I have here Ella Baker Center. They did this wonderful, very comprehensive research report about who pays for mass incarceration, and I have the link there. And so I just would like to direct you to some of their work, because they're doing some really, really innovative, wonderful work that just speaks to all the ways in which Black and brown women disproportionately are carrying the burden, right, of mass incarceration in terms of having to support those who have been incarcerated, right? And so it's not just at the financial level, right, but it's opportunities that are lost as a result of maintaining familial ties. So maybe foregoing an educational opportunity because you want to be close to your partner or whomever may be incarcerated, right? Those kinds of things. Okay. So all of that to say, what I also found in my research is that women are agentic and there is agency and they are practicing resistance strategies. And so what I found is that these experiences were encouraging Black women to become engaged in political work. And oftentimes they were becoming radicalized around this, right? Engaging in activism and organizing, engaging in abolition work, advocating for themselves within their relationships, right? So this idea of it's not so much that women were saying, oh, I'm just not going to engage in relationships at all, right? But then navigating those relationships in the ways that can be beneficial for them in order to get their needs met. And so there was some of that as well. Also creating formal and informal support groups for those with incarcerated loved ones was one of the salient themes that came out, is that women were finding one another, right, in these communities in order to lean on one another for support. And also there were some women who were choosing personal and financial growth opportunities, such as going back to school. I had a few participants who were college students. They were working on their associates. And then there were a few who were doing entrepreneurial work as well. So in terms of the discussion around this, we know that incarceration is a form of state-sanctioned violence, and it exacerbates the risk of emotional and psychological abuse among Black women, the loss of mutually fulfilling opportunities for romantic connection and wealth building through partnership. And I argue that we can reimagine where we locate carceral violence and how it shows up in the most intimate of spaces in Black women's lives. So thinking about incarceration, not just as this brick and mortar space and the ways in which we navigate that, but the way that it shows up in the most intimate of spaces, right? Which is in romantic connections. And also this idea of the spoils of the drug war. And so I have to talk about my girlfriend, and she gave me permission to say her name. Her name is Sophia Britton, one of the most brilliant women I know. I love her. She's one of my best friends. And we were having these conversations, you know, as Black women, we talk about these things, you know, well, what's going on? And, you know, these men are doing this and blah, 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 whatever. But I was talking to her about my research. And I was saying, yeah, you know, and these women are navigating these relationships in ways where they want to be partnered, but yet and still they're not getting exactly what it is that they need, and they're being gaslit in this way. And, you know, and she says, yeah, you know, it's the spoils of war. And I thought, it absolutely is. It's the spoils of the drug war, right? Where it's not so much that, you know, well, it is. It's that men they know that they're a bit of a hot commodity right now because there's a gender disparity that exists within the Black community where there are more women than there are men. And then if you take, you know, you think about incarceration, you think about high rates of homicide and death, and of just those who are eligible to partner, right, that it gets even less from which to, the pool, right, gets even less from which to choose. And so men are, in essence, taking advantage of this in a lot of ways. And so in that way, it's that, you know, they are benefiting from the spoils of the drug war. It's kind of a crude way to discuss it, but we haven't seen people talk about the spoils of the drug war aside from the economic plunder that has gone on, right? And so I'd like to move this kind of framing into the intimate sphere, right? And look at the ways in which it's impacting on Black women's romantic lives. So in that way, we see there's a benefit, who benefits in that way and who is harmed. But then we also have to look at this broader structure of how, while Black women are also bearing a lot of the burden of maintaining familial ties and romantic connections with those who are incarcerated. So then the state is still benefiting from Black women's oppression. If that makes sense, it's kind of it's a nuanced argument that I'm trying to make, and I'm not sure if I'm making it very well, but I'm trying. So stay with me, and then in Q&A, you could ask me to flesh that out a little bit further. And so, you know, lastly, let's endeavor to end all oppressive forms of state surveillance, criminalization, correctional control, and incarceration. So for future research, you know, I mean, this this research is in its nascent stage. It's just the beginning. I'm thinking about, examining what happens within LGBTQ relationships for those people who might be similarly situated. Also, how does colorism play a role in Black women's choices? There are a lot of people who are doing some good work around this. And also, how does parenthood impact Black women's choices? So the one thing I want to say is that it's not a causal argument that I'm making. It's that mass incarceration intervenes in this way on the lives of Black women in conjunction with all of these other types of oppressive barriers that are already existing, right, in these communities. I spoke earlier of, joblessness and unemployment, underemployment, these kinds of economic barriers, right? Lack of access to resources, education. I mean, you've already seen how they've tried so hard to roll back, right, access to voting. All of these things impact on these communities, and they converge in a way where Black women are having to mitigate and navigate these different barriers, simultaneously. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to end there. Here are some resources. I wanted to give a shout out to All of Us or None. Some of you may or may not already be familiar, but they're doing some wonderful work advocating for formerly incarcerated people and their families and loved ones. Legal Services for Prisoners with Children is another great organization. I suggest please check them out. And then, of course, the African American Policy Forum, who does work on about Black women and police violence against Black women and violence against Black women more broadly. So check out those resources if you're interested in this work. Thank you very much for your time. Questions and answers I'm available for. And I'm going to stop my sharing my screen now. Okay.
Thank you both so much for being here today. And I do have a question for Ms. Sophia Davis. And it says, thank you, Sophia, for your incredible presentation. In regards to the crisis at Rikers Island, do you see any change happening in the future, or do you think it will likely get worse before it gets better? What do you think the key to the catalyst change, even in that specific scenario?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So there are a few changes that are currently taking place on Rikers Island. People have talked about shutting down Rikers Island for years now. De Blasio swore to shut down Rikers Island for years. He hasn't done it. If you talk to anybody in New York City, on the left or the right, and pretty much everyone can agree that de Blasio is a useless mayor, like useless. But he will no longer be mayor pretty soon. But there are changes that are taking place. So there was recently the Less is More Act was just passed by our governor, which will pretty much means that like people that violate parole won't be sent to jail, and it's actually going to save hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer money. And it's also the de Blasio set a goal to speed up the intake process so that there are fewer people on the island at a time. And he also announced plans to send in, I believe it was like 100 NYPD officers. That's a little iffy because, I mean, as my presentation has demonstrated, the NYPD, just because, you've got the badge doesn't mean that you are truly upholding and defending law and order. These officers, when they're sent to Rikers Island, they still like torment and torture these incarcerated people. So there are changes that are taking place. However, I would say that the main thing that needs to happen in order to really get the ball rolling is outrage. That's the only thing that makes changes. When people saw what the NYPD was doing, and when they saw the videos of peaceful protesters getting run over by cop cars, that made people furious, and actually the number of arrests went down. We're seeing fewer people get arrested and having to go into court than we did just a few years ago, because people are now talking about the problem. The question is, how do we get people to talk about Rikers Island? And we're doing kind of a back and forth on this right now in prop. We had a meeting earlier today where we're discussing a new project that we're going to start to we're going to start monitoring the DAs and the judges, the worst DAs and the worst judges in the city that are sending the most people to Rikers Island, and try and get some more publicity around that. A lot of the work that we do is referenced by journalists in, news articles. So if we can churn out more research and more evidence of specific judges and specific DAs that are causing problems, and then add on top of that all of this evidence that we're seeing of people that are dying on Rikers Island, hopefully that will spur some more conversation. But at the time, as of right now, most of the changes that are taking place are on the legal level, and there's not much necessarily on the ground. But changes are taking place slowly, but the issue still prevails, and all we can really do is just try and make sure that people are talking about it in order for actual substantive change to happen. So thank you again.
Sophia, I'm gonna butt in at the end of your the answer to your question. Do you recall the case of Khalif Browder?
So that was actually, yes, I do recall the case.
We have spoken about him in this space, but you might want to remind our audience who he was and what happened to him.
So Khalif Browder, I believe he was a resident of the Bronx, but I'm not 100% sure about that. When he was a teenager, he was arrested, wrongfully arrested actually, for stealing a backpack. And he was, I think he was coerced into, it was either confessing or he refused to confess to the crime. And so they sent him to Rikers Island when he was 16 or 17. And while on Rikers Island, he was subject to all kinds of abuse from other incarcerated people on Rikers Island, and especially the guards. They beat him brutally, and there's actually video evidence. You can look up the surveillance footage of him being beat by these officers. He was actually sent to solitary confinement, and he spent 2 to 3 years, I'm forgetting the exact number, 2 to 3 years on Rikers Island in solitary confinement. And during that period, he suffered physical and mental harm that permanently damaged him and traumatized him. And after being released from Rikers Island, he started going to community college, and he was really, trying to sort of build, a life for himself after being incarcerated. But it was really, really hard. There's actually a documentary about it. I can find it and maybe send the link. His mother just talks about how he would pace around his room at night, talking to people that weren't there. He felt as that when he was at home, he felt like he was still trapped in that cell. And he hung himself just a few years after he was released. It's really, really tragic. And he was my age when it took place. So yeah.
Well, that was a off the cuff question, and I'm so glad you were able to answer it. But I think Khalif is just an example of the tragedy that can happen times millions with young people being eaten up by the system. There's no way a 16-year-old should have been sent to Rikers Island to begin with. And then for them to forget about him, because the system, as you've seen in visiting these courts, the system is massive, and it just churns out, and it forgets about some people, maybe on purpose or maybe accidentally. But I think it's and this became a huge media event. It was covered in the New Yorker and other publications over and over and over. And I think he won a settlement, didn't he? Like a settlement from the city. I'm not sure, so don't quote me on that. But
I believe so. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
But when it comes to the actual, so it actually is illegal now. I just found this out. I was looking at
to send juveniles.
Yeah, it's my mom just sent me a text too. It is illegal now for 16 and 17-year-olds to be sent to Rikers Island, which is incredible. But still, there are thousands, tens of thousands of young Black and Hispanic men that have been traumatized and are continuing to be traumatized by the system. And unfortunately, we were lucky enough to find out about Khalif's story and just how tragic that is, but that happens every single day. It is so common and it is so pervasive and it is so destructive. And it's also, I think it's really important to note the way in which it's actually kind of like it's a cyclical thing, really, because these men are incriminated, and then their communities are pretty much burdened with this, with losing 1 in 3 Black men are going to spend time in jail at some point in their lives. So their communities are burdened with this. They're children that aren't raised without a father at home, and that on top of the so many systemic issues like poor housing, poor access to quality food and education, that those systemic problems, those are oftentimes a really big reason why crime and desperation in these communities that are typically historically redlined communities of color, they are burdened with this. And so obviously when you are desperate and when you have been failed by your city and by your state, you will commit crime in order to survive. And then people commit those crimes, they're sent to jail, and then you have the right-wing media that blames them for that and says, look at these Black people, they don't know how to hold their own, they don't know, their culture just breeds this violence in their young men, right? That's why we need cops. And then the cops are deployed and the cycle begins all over again. It's really, really, really tragic.
Thank you.
I do remember back in, I think it was around the 2000, New York, the Blacks in New York that were called to jury duty just made a stand, and the stand was, if they got jury duty, they were going to set a brother free. And they actually went to jury duty, and they actually, even if the guy was stone guilty, if it was a nonviolent crime, a drug crime, because the guy was caught smoking weed or whatever it was, if it was a crime and not against anybody but himself, they would go into court and they would set him free. And the judges got a little frustrated, but then they realized that the courts for white folks were setting white criminals free also because the jury would not convict. And so the judge came back and he said that, I'm not going to fight this, but it stopped. It finally stopped. But for a while in New York, they were setting brothers free because no matter how bad and how guilty they were, they cut them loose. One of the questions I got is, I might have missed the beginning, but Sophia, she wants to know what organization you are with.
Yeah, so I'm with the Police Reform Organizing Project, PROP for short. I can send the link to our website in the chat.
And another thing, and I'll get to you, Dr. Monterrosa. But another thing that I really like what you said is clashing of narratives. So the police think they're doing one thing, and citizens see another thing. Could you talk on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I don't think that the police actually think that they're how do I say it? I think that the police and I think that the system of the NYPD is aware of what they're doing. It's just that they don't care. Like it's not about it, and it's never been about law and order. It's like it has literally never been about that. It is, for example, it is illegal for police departments, for precincts to have quotas on the number of people that they're supposed to arrest. But talk to any cop, the first question that they ask when they get hired to a precinct is, so what are my productivity requirements? They don't call them quotas, they call them productivity requirements. And it's this unofficial thing that, like they don't really want to, the quotas are illegal, right? But they do have a number that they're supposed to meet at the end of the day. And who are the people that are getting arrested? Who are the people that are getting harassed? It's poor people of color. That's just the reality. And so when it comes to the clashing narratives, I think that you've got the police that are committing these atrocities, and then you have this whole kind of bubble of propaganda, we call it copaganda, that is fueling the narrative that they are necessary. The police as we know it today are necessary. Now, I will say I'm currently conducting research, and I'm going to start writing a paper soon on the origins of the NYPD, kind of tracing their the trajectory from the mid 19th century all the way up to today. Understand the ways in which the department kind of developed to become what it is. It's like from the very beginning they were corrupt from the very beginning, and everything that we see in terms of the media and all that kind of stuff just completely ignores that. And it's because who do these cops serve? Truly, who do they serve? If we look at the Met Gala, for example, recently, I don't know if anyone knows about this, but right outside of the Met Gala, there were protests taking place about, I think it had to do with wealth inequality, as far as I know. That's what a lot of the signs were saying. And these were peaceful, completely peaceful protests, and the cops were out there dragging people through the street. There's so much evidence of this online. Right in there, as these wealthy people are having this celebration of their wealth and their power, people right outside are getting arrested and attacked by the cops. I feel like that was just the most recent and most obvious example of how of who these cops are defending, right? And when I say clashing narratives, I mean there's, people on Fox News will say that the people, that there were rioters and looters outside of the the Met Gala, but I mean, you see for yourself. It's the evidence exists. It's there. That's what I mean by clashing narratives.
Thank you, Dr. Monterrosa. Question is, she says, what are the 4 theories? Sorry, I missed the last one. She wanted to know what the 4 theories were.
Yeah, so I was talking about Patricia Hill Collins and the Matrix of Domination. So this Black feminist thought, or Black feminist theory, intersectionality that originates with Kimberly Crenshaw, and then Black feminist criminology, which is Hilary Potter's work. Those are the main 3 theoretical frames that I used around my research, and it helped guide my research design as well as my analysis. And the 4th thing on there was just my own positionality as a Black woman, as a survivor of intimate partner violence, and being system impacted as well.
Thank you. I was curious. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Stan, I didn't write the question in because I'm lazy, but I do have a couple of questions for
Go right ahead.
Dr. Monterrosa. Allison, I'm just wondering, I don't know if I missed it. I'm wondering how you got your participants. Can you talk a little bit about that? These 30 women, and then also, can you talk a little bit more about the children, because they're something like, I don't know, 65% of Black kids are, they have had at one point or other an incarcerated parent. And so I know your research was not focused on the children, but have you made any sort of peripheral observations about children in these who are caught up in these relationships with their parents?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I would say, so in terms of the children, I would say, because my research didn't really center how children were impacted, I can talk about how Black women talked about the way in which they were navigating these relationships and caring for children. So one instance where their partner needed to go to work, and so she would give rides, but then ended up not being able to do that because that was going to be disruptive to her daughter, because the hours of which he needed to work were in the wee hours of the night, or wee hours in the morning. And so not wanting to disrupt her daughter, she had to make a choice to not give him a ride, or take a chance and let him drive, although he didn't have a license, right? But that would then risk the possibility, if he were to get pulled over, of him violating. Mm-hmm. So, those are the kinds of decisions that women were making in that way. I'm sorry, can you remind me of your first question again?
I was just wondering how you, for want of a better term, gathered your women, your participants.
Yes, so I worked with, it's called the Black Women's Leadership Forum. It's a local nonprofit here in Riverside County. And part of that work was advertising there, and a lot of it was snowball sampling and word of mouth. So that's how I gathered many of my participants. Some participants who were engaged in All of Us or None. I was able to kind of hand out some flyers at an event that was held at the Capitol one year. And so in that way, I was able to kind of garner some people to become participants. So, but it was largely snowball sampling.
Great, thank you.
Mary took my questions, so that was my question.
Sorry, Stan.
No, that's okay. But my real question was, were the women in a loop? In other words, were they stuck with dating and romantically involved with criminals or incarcerated?
So many of the women were involved with men who were impacted in that they were cycling in and out of the prison and jail system. So not so much. There were a few women who were involved with men who were incarcerated, and they talked about previous relationships with men who were incarcerated, and they would go and do the visits and things like that. But the majority of my sample, which skewed largely more on the younger side, largely around between 20 and 30 years old, they were dealing with men who were cycling in and out of the prison and jail system, or had some kind of case or something where they had to go to court, navigating different kinds of paperwork. And so that was the kind of labor that they were engaging in with their partners.
Thank you. Sophia, there's a question that says, what is one way in particular, there may be many, to create change within the justice system? In other words, what's going on in New York with the Rikers and all the, and you go through the prison system, and one of the things that I've seen is a lot of poor people don't have good lawyers.
Or no lawyers. They have public defenders, which is
Exactly.
worse.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many different levels of change that could take place, because it doesn't just have to do with the police. And it doesn't just have to do with the issue of crime. A lot of times we get stuck in this idea that crime it's just this, what is it called? This biological determinism. I've heard this from a lot of people on the right, that some people are just destined to commit crime, that it's in their DNA, right? This is a racist implication, obviously. And it's, I don't like, so we have this idea that, you know, crime is just this inherent thing, or it's a cultural thing, and that Black culture just breeds crime, that, you know, hip hop music is the thing that's getting all these kids hooked on crime. But we don't say that when Quentin Tarantino is out here making movies about white dudes shooting each other. It's just that white men are not obligated with this burden to defend their entire race and to you know, be the spokespeople of their race. They are not expected to do that at all. And so I think that when we need to understand what exactly is crime. Where does crime come from? And the answer is, it has largely to do with, again, systemic failures. If you don't have access to even to good food, instead of a grocery store on the corner, there's a liquor store on every corner, immediately that's a problem. If the heating and the cooling system in your building is messed up, if you've got rats and roaches in your building that you can't get rid of, if your schools are just so overcrowded and the facilities are so broken down, you have textbooks that are so outdated. If you have, say, a parent that's working so hard that they can never be home, they have to, you know, work multiple jobs in order to support you. Just that alone, there's evidence that shows that the link between these systemic failures and crime is undeniable. So the changes that have to take place on multiple levels. But I think in terms of the police itself, we need to completely reshape the responsibilities that they have. We cannot expect cops to be law enforcement professionals, to be mental health professionals, to be childcare professionals. These are all the things the cops are expected to do. We cannot, and the cops are not trained in all of these things. A lot of these cops only have a high school degree. How are you supposed to address all of these societal problems with just the training that you've had and with a high school degree? It's impossible. But I think that on an individual level, what we can do is, first of all, we need to talk about it. We need to get people really angry, but we can't just get stuck there. I think that's something that a lot of people in my generation do, is they get stuck on the raising awareness phase. I call it the disease of the Instagram infographic. So a lot of times you've got, there's this whole thing on Instagram pretty much where people just post, a lot of like infographics about, say, I don't know, it could be anything, environmental problems, criminal justice, you name it, different issues in societies. And sometimes there's just misinformation. Like sometimes the information they have on these infographics are complete lies. In other cases, they are completely true, but what societal changes are going to take place by you posting an infographic on Instagram and then just doing nothing about it? Sure, people may talk about it, but chances are vast majority of people are just going to swipe past your Instagram story and never think about it again. Like, it's not enough for us to simply just post about things, to post our little black squares and to just be done with it. We have to actually be going out. If there are any mutual aid groups that are in your community that you can take part in, if you can provide tutoring to younger children, if you can, anything that you can do, if you are in a position of privilege, as I am and many other people are, even as a Black woman, obviously there are issues that I face in society, but as someone who is socioeconomically privileged, I have the time and I have the energy to be able to go out and do what I can in order to help my community and to ameliorate some of the struggles that people are dealing with. So I really, that's what I think people can do. And a lot of times I talk about this a lot with my mom, because I see this sign in Brooklyn. There's this white liberal culture where people just post signs up and they never do anything about it. It's all performative activism. It's all a way of virtue signaling and showing people that you care about stuff that you never actually think about, or it's not something, it's just a way of signaling to other people that oh, look, I'm woke. There's this sign down the street from my house that says, this guy puts a sign in this window that says, "Imagine equality." That's it. That's the sign. Imagine equality. And I see this sign every time I pass by. Sometimes I just want to knock on this guy's door and just explain to me what this means. I'm so glad that he's having a fun time imagining equality in this little contrived universe that he's come up with in his mind. I hope he smells the roses and he jump rope, and he's just having such a fun time in this little universe of imagined equality. But the real work is not just imagining, it's actually going out there and not just fighting for equality, but for justice. Justice is what we need. And it's something that, especially people that are socioeconomically privileged, it's something that we can do, something we can do on an everyday basis. So of course, there's all these legislative changes that we can do, and those are going to take place by voting in the correct district attorneys and, better politicians. But at the end of the day, so much of it just comes down to what we can do on an individual basis. And there's a lot. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Once again, on a Monday, I could ask a million questions and we could go on and on and on, but I'm gonna give it back to Ms. Jade.
There is only 5 minutes left of the webinar, so if there's any closing comments from either of our guest speakers, feel free to say anything.
Allison, where's your work going from here? Are you gonna publish a book?
I've been asked, I don't know. I wrote my dissertation in article form. So it's a possibility that I can kind of reformat and write a book. But I'm now looking at Black women's experiences with police violence and the way in which the news media kind of situates that, particularly when you're thinking about Black women and the different kinds of negative stereotypes that they have to navigate and mitigate and then endure throughout the course of a lifetime. And so this idea of who gets to be a victim, right? Who's deserving of care, love, concern, is one of the things that I'm looking at, particularly when it comes to police violence and the way it's depicted against Black women and the way it's depicted in the media. Yeah. And I did want to say one other thing about when I was talking about the spoils of the drug war, I was saying, oh, I wanted to mention my girlfriend, Sakithia Britton, who, when I called her this morning and I said, is it okay if I mention you by name? She says, yeah, I don't care. And we got into this whole conversation about all the different ways in which the drug war has impacted on Black communities, not only just within our romantic relationships with Black men, but much like what Sophia has been discussing, is that it permeates into almost every aspect of our lives. And so this is, I'm really, proud to be able to have been invited to come and share my research with everyone here today. And yeah, just keep fighting the good fight is what I have to say. This is all good work, and it's all going towards trying to create some real structural changes here.
Well, we should mention that you are a brand new professor, and you probably don't want to hear anything about publishing right now. You're just trying to probably get through your classes, right? And thank you to your class for coming today too. That is wonderful. And the last thing I have to say is that with young people like Sophia, we have left I've said this many times before, but we're leaving this world a mess. And from what Sophia has said today, I'm really, really encouraged by the next generation. What is your generation called, Sophia? Is it Z? Gen Z?
Yes.
Okay. Gen Z is going to save the world. So thank you all for coming today.
If you got Z,
wonderful.
what's going to be next?
Well, let's hope there is a next. I hope that wasn't prophetic, the last Generation Z.
Thank both of you for coming out. And Allison, I really appreciate that you specified your study on romance and how it affects. And Sophia, thank you for sitting in those courtrooms and learning so much of what you do. And I see you have a good life ahead of you. And it's really funny. I'm financially sound in the world, and yet I still go in the courtroom and 3 cops surround me. So discussion, you're Black. So don't forget that. And when you walk through life, the bottom line is they don't know how much you got in your pocket or where you live. They just know you're a Black person in their circle. So be safe out there, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jade. Thank you, Connie. You guys have been great. And I guess we can sign off.
Thank you.
Be safe, everyone. Bye-bye.